Hey guys, do you know how cruel some ancient societies really were? I mean, we're talking about hearts being ripped from living people as an offering. Children, the weak ones, left to die, or trained to kill before they even understood what death was. Gladiators thrown into sand pits like meat for sport. Eagles that weren't birds, but punishments carved into living backs. It's not the kind of history we're usually told gently, but tonight, we're going to explore it slowly, quietly, with the kind of reverence that horror sometimes deserves. So lie back, get comfortable, because the past wasn't always heroic. Sometimes, it was just terrifying. And before we begin, if this kind of story feels right, slow, quiet, something to drift into, go ahead and tap like, maybe subscribe, if you want more of this. No rush, no pressure. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What's the weather like out your window? I always like knowing. Alright, let's begin. Close your eyes for a second. Let the modern world fade a little. Imagine a stone pyramid, tall, steep, rising like a staircase into the sun. The air is thin. There's incense, smoke, the smell of flowers, and something else, something iron and sharp. You're standing in Tenochtitlán, the heart of the Aztec Empire, a city of canals and causeways, temples and warriors. But this isn't a sleepy town. It's pulsing, alive, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear the drum beats, slow at first, then rising. The setter calling someone to the top. The prisoner, captured in battle, climbing, surrounded by masked priests, his heart beating faster than the drum. He knows what comes next. Everyone does. And still, he climbs. The Aztecs didn't do human sacrifice to be cruel. Not in their own minds. To them, it was duty. It was sacred. It was how the universe stayed in balance. Because their gods, powerful, terrifying, and endlessly hungry, had sacrificed themselves to create the world. The sun rose because of blood. The rain fell because of flesh. If the gods gave their hearts once, it was only fair to return the favor. They believed the sun needed energy to keep moving across the sky, and energy meant life. Life meant blood, human blood. Specifically, there were many gods, but the one most often fed was Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, the god of war, a god born in battle, and obsessed with it. When he rose every morning, it wasn't just dawn, it was him winning, fighting his way across the heavens. And when he set, the fear was always, what if he doesn't win tomorrow? So the Aztecs helped. They gave him what he wanted, hearts. The sacrifices were part of festivals, huge ones. Picture a city dressed in bright colors, music echoing across water, priests in feathered robes, faces painted like skulls, and people, thousands of them, watching. The chosen victims weren't always enemies. Sometimes, they were volunteers, warriors who believed it was the highest honor. Sometimes slaves, sometimes children. Each god had preferences. Some wanted the young, others wanted warriors. Still others wanted people to be drowned or burned or flayed. But for Huitzilopochtli, it was the chest, the knife, the heart. The victim would be laid across a stone, his chest stretched upward. A priest would take a blade, usually obsidian, sharp as glass, and with one practiced, brutal movement, cut into the flesh. Crack bone, reach in, and pull the heart out while it was still beating. It wasn't meant to be torture. It was fast, efficient, ritualized, and deeply believed. The heart was raised to the sky, sometimes burned, sometimes buried, sometimes placed in a ceremonial vessel, and the body rolled down the temple steps. Why the rolling? It was part of the show, but also part of the offering. That body, it had served its purpose. Now it returned to the earth, back to where it came from. And the steps, they weren't just decoration, they were symbolic, movement, descent, like rain falling after a sacrifice. The priests believed they were helping, not harming. The world was cruel. Blood made it kinder. Strange, isn't it? The logic of horror. Some scholars argue these rituals were political too, a way for the Aztec elite to show power, to scare enemies, to impress allies, to unite the people under a shared fear and faith. And yes, that sits true. But when you lie in bed at night, picturing that pyramid, the real weight isn't in politics. It's in the drumbeats, the choice to climb, the belief that death wasn't the end, but the beginning of something sacred. They didn't see it as cruelty. They saw it as balance, a bloody, breathless kind of balance. And the heart was just the cost. The heart was more than a symbol. It was believed to contain the tonal eye, a kind of spiritual heat, a fragment of divine fire. And for the Aztecs, this inner warmth wasn't poetic, it was essential. Without it, the world cooled, the gods weakened, crops failed, night lingered. So every ceremony wasn't just a tradition, it was a necessity. Imagine thinking the sun won't rise unless enough blood is spilled. Imagine waking up to a cloudy morning and wondering, did we not give enough? The priests lived with that weight. They were trained from youth, chosen from noble families. Some grew up never touching a weapon, only studying the stars, the winds, the chants. Others were warriors first, bloodied in battle, honored by scars. But once you wore the mask, once you took up the obsidian blade, you were something different, a bridge between people and gods. And bridges carry things both ways. Not every sacrifice was the same. Some were private, quiet, done in smaller temples, sometimes even at home. A whispered prayer, a small animal, a drop of blood drawn from the tongue, or the ear, or the thigh. Yes, they pierced themselves too, for devotion, for forgiveness, for balance. The gods didn't always demand a heart. Sometimes, a little pain was enough. But on holy days, when the crowds gathered and the temples rang with drums, the gods expected more, much more. There was one festival, held every 52 years, called the Binding of the Years. The Aztecs believed that at the end of each cycle, the world might end, that the sun might not return, that everything, every market, every meal, every birth could vanish into darkness. So they put out every fire, every single flame in the empire. And then they waited. On the night of the new fire, priests climbed a sacred hill outside the city. They brought a prisoner with them, chosen carefully, dressed in ceremonial robes. And when the stars aligned, when the constellation of fire rose overhead, they cut him open and lit a flame in the cavity of his chest. Yes, they struck a spark inside a human body, and if it caught, and the fire glowed, they knew the world would continue. Then, torch by torch, that flame was carried down the hill, through the fields, across the lakes, into every hearth, every home, every temple. A world rekindled in the chest of a man. You can call it barbaric, but to them, it was survival. That was their science, their promise, their dawn. And somewhere, deep down, it was also their fear. There were seasons to sacrifice, not just in the calendar, but in the rhythm of life. Some months were gentler, marked by offerings of corn, song, and incense. But others turned red. Take Tenochtitlán, the flaying of men, a spring festival, bright, floral, and deeply grim. It honored Totec, the god of renewal, fertility, and skin. Yes, skin. Because for life to be born, something old had to be stripped away. During the festival, captured warriors were tied to stone platforms. They were armed, yes, with wooden swords tipped in feathers. Their opponents were real, sharp, and trained. And when the battle ended, and it always ended, The captured man's body was taken and flayed, his skin peeled away like old bark, but not discarded. The skin was worn. Priests draped themselves in it, walked among the people for days like shedding ghosts, a reminder that beneath every death was life. The skin would decay, smell, fall apart, but it was sacred. It was seen as a costume of the gods, an old body cast off, so that the world could wear a new one. To us, it sounds grotesque. To them, it was spring. And what of the people? Did they all cheer? Did they all believe? No society is unanimous. Some whispered doubts, some feared the priests. Some wept quietly when their sons were chosen, but for many, belief ran deeper than fear. Think of it this way. If your world was fed by sacrifice, if your rains depended on ritual, if your crops withered during years when the blood wasn't fresh enough, wouldn't you believe too? There was no separation between the spiritual and the real. Drought wasn't just weather, it was judgment. Famine wasn't just poor harvest. It meant the gods were weakening, so the people gave corn, feathers, dogs, their own blood, drawn on cactus spines and left to soak into altars. And when that wasn't enough, they gave hearts. And even those who feared it, those who hated it, they didn't deny it. They couldn't stet, because the sun still rose. And what if that was the reason? Sometimes, a chosen victim would live for months in luxury. They were called Ixipla, impersonators of gods. These weren't prisoners. Not at first. They were treated as divine. Fed, clothed, honored. Musicians followed them. Women danced for them. Children brought them flowers. They walked through Tenochtitlán like living idols. But they knew. They always knew. Their life was a countdown. And when the day came, they would be led through the city, through canals and bridges and feather-draped streets, up the steps of the great temple, and at the top, they would lie down. They didn't stet run. They didn't scream. They were trained for this. Honored, beloved, and then, with solemn hands and a chant that echoed across rooftops, the knife came down. The blade glinted. The chest opened, and the god was fed. There are murals still, stone carvings, glyphs, etched into walls, where jungle vines have curled in, softening the edges. They show the rituals, the blades, the hearts, but also the sun, always the sun, smiling, bleeding, surviving. Because sacrifice wasn't just destruction, it was creation. In Aztec myth, this wasn't the first world, it was the fifth. The four before had all failed, devoured, drowned, broken by giants, swallowed by jaguars. This one, this world, it held only because of blood. Every sunrise was a miracle. Every death, a down payment on tomorrow. Warfare wasn't just about land for the Aztecs. It wasn't even always about winning. It was about capturing, because hearts had to come from somewhere. The Aztecs waged something they called flower wars, battles not fought to destroy the enemy, but to gather sacrifice. Two sides would meet. Weapons were dulled just enough to avoid killing too quickly. The goal wasn't to wipe out. It was to overwhelm, to capture, to bring bodies back alive, because dead men can't offer hearts. And the gods were particular. So young warriors were trained not only to fight, but to hold back the killing blow, to aim for the legs, to trap, to carry. And those they brought home, they didn't see as enemies anymore. They saw them as gifts. That might be the hardest part to understand now. That someone could be a gift, and a person, a prisoner, and a vessel, a name and an offering. But this was how the world worked. Temples weren't just temples. They were machines, designed for ritual, aligned with stars, engineered to move people upward and blood downward. The steps of the Temple Mayor, the great temple, were steep, narrow, high. But they weren't arbitrary. They were intentional. The body of the sacrifice would fall in a certain way, bounce, maybe, strike certain ledges, and all of it, the impact, the descent, the sound, was seen, watched, felt. The blood would sometimes be gathered in troughs, carried down, used to mark sacred objects, even painted on statues. There were drains built into some temples, sloped floors, grooves carved by centuries of footsteps, and maybe more than footsteps. It wasn't just death. It was spectacle. It was architecture meant to echo belief. And when the Spanish came, they watched in horror. They didn't understand. Or maybe they didn't want to. They called the Aztecs savages. Demons, said the sacrifices were proof of evil. And yes, the rituals were violent. Yes, they were terrifying. But so was conquest. So was plague. So was a musket fired into a crowd that had no steel. The Spaniards destroyed temples, tore down the Templo Mayor, built churches on top of the ruins, burned codices, silenced the chants, and yet, they kept the gold, they marveled at the feathers, they admired the stones, they erased what they didn't like, and kept what they did. That too was a kind of sacrifice, but not to gods, to empire. Still, some records survived. Not all the voices were silenced, and from what's left, from fragments and carvings and clay, we can begin to imagine what it felt like to be there, to live under a sky you thought might fall if someone didn't bleed today, to hear drums and not think of music, but of obligation, to love your child and still fear they might be chosen, because belief didn't cancel grief. Even the most devoted priest might weep when the ceremony was over, quietly. Alone, behind a mask that smelled of blood and resin, the people watching didn't cheer, not loudly. Sometimes they chanted, sometimes they just stood still. There was reverence in the silence, a kind of hush that settled after the heart had been lifted, a knowing, a fear, a hope. And that's maybe what's left behind now, in the dust of those stones, in the bones turned to museum pieces, in the names spoken slowly by tour guides and schoolchildren. A trace of something deeper, not just violence, not just ritual, but a truth that once, long ago, a people believed the sun would not rise unless they helped it, and so they did, with fire, and flowers, and song, and hearts. Imagine a jungle, dense, wet, alive with buzzing things and soft dripping sounds, vines curling around stone, trees growing through buildings, and hidden beneath all of it, the bones of a civilization that once touched the stars. You're walking through what used to be a city. Not a village, a city, with observatories, temples, marketplaces, ball courts, where heroes once ran, and the losers, well, not everyone walked away. The Maya didn't just build homes, they built calendars that outlived them. They carved stories into stone that the rain hasn't yet washed away. But now, the streets are silent. You step over a fallen lintel. You brush past roots that weren't there centuries ago, and somewhere nearby, maybe beneath your feet, there's a royal tomb no one's opened. No one even knows it's there. The Maya built cities for the gods. But the gods didn't stay forever, and neither did the people. They left. Not all at once, not everywhere, but city after city emptied, as if something whispered through the jungle, and the people listened. Come away. Go now. Disappear. The collapse wasn't a single event. It was slow. Decades, even centuries. One city falling quiet, then another, trade routes fading, roads swallowed by vines, great plazas left to the beetles and the rain, and no one knows why. Not exactly. Some say drought, a long, brutal drying of the world, crops failing, reservoirs cracking, Families gathering under thatched roofs, watching the skies, hoping for clouds, getting none. Some say warfare. City-states fighting for control. Too many kings. Too many enemies. Not enough people left to grow food or bury the dead. Some say religion lost its grip, that the old rituals stopped working. The rain stopped coming, the gods stopped answering, or maybe the people just gave up listening. Imagine believing your gods controlled the rain, and then watching the sky stay dry, not for days, not for weeks, for years. Your sacred wells, the cenotes, sink lower and lower, the maize dries on the stalk, the rivers thin, the children cough more often, and still, the priests say to keep offering. So you do. You burn incense. You chant. You offer feathers, jade, even blood, sometimes your own, sometimes someone else's. You do what the gods always seem to want, but the sky doesn't listen, and that silence starts to feel louder than any storm ever did. Because the Maya weren't primitive, not even close. They charted the planets with eerie precision, built observatories before telescopes were invented. They knew when eclipses were coming. They measured the slow wobble of Venus, counted days in cycles so vast, most people today can't imagine them. They wrote books, thousands of them, beautiful things, filled with stars, and gods, and medicine, and mathematics. Almost all were burned, not by time, but by fire and fear. And yet, even the ones we lost, you can almost feel them. They're ghosts, tucked in the corners of broken temples, wrapped in the roots of strangler figs. The Maya wrote on stone too. On stelae, tall slabs placed in ceremonial plazas, dates, names, events carved into their faces. Some show kings receiving power, others show wars, others just stop. There's one, in a place once called Dos Pilas. It tells of a royal family, rulers of a mighty city. The stone carvings track their wars, their triumphs. Then one line says they fled, just left. The next lines are blank, and the forest took the rest. The forest always does. Some cities fought to the end, others faded like dreams. You can see it in the bones. Archaeologists find mass graves with no ceremony, starved people buried together, or not buried at all. Other places, no bones, no fire, just absence, as if the people walked into the trees one morning and didn't come back. Maybe they scattered, moved north, found new homes. Not all Maya vanished. Millions of their descendants are still here, still speaking their languages, still weaving and planting and whispering prayers. But the cities, the shining stone-walled cities, they didn't survive. Too heavy, too big, too rooted in a system that had cracked long before the walls did. Imagine being the last child in a royal palace, running barefoot through abandoned halls, drinking from a dried-up well, watching your parents kneel before idols that no longer speak, and wondering if gods can die from loneliness. The Maya didn't disappear in fire. They disappeared in silence, in vines, in slow goodbyes, and we're still trying to understand what they were saying. Just before they stopped speaking, they built with limestone in memory. They stacked stones without mortar, fitting each block so precisely that even centuries later, the jungle struggles to pull them apart. A Maya city didn't just rise from the earth. It was shaped by it. Temples built to mirror mountains, pyramids placed where shadows would fall perfectly on equinoxes. Every inch of ground, every path was chosen, and those paths are still there, covered now in leaves and silence. But if you walk carefully, you can feel the slope of them under your feet, like an echo trapped in the dirt. Somewhere beneath that moss, someone once walked in gold, or feathers, or both. The Maya had kings, divine ones, chosen by gods, crowned in obsidian and jade, but they also had scribes, astronomers, engineers, artists. You can see their handprints on the walls of ruined runes, the red pigment still clinging after 1,000 years, as if someone touched stone just once, and it remembered. They didn't call themselves Maya, by the way. That name came later. From others, what they called themselves varied from place to place, city to city. Each one had its own name, its own dialect, its own way of honoring the sky. That's what makes their disappearance even stranger. It wasn't just one city, not just one people. It was dozens, sometimes hundreds, falling quiet in waves, a whisper rippling across centuries. Some survived longer than others. Chichen Itza, Uxmal, but even they would eventually fade. And yet, the jungle is patient. It grew back over the plazas. It pulled down roofs and wrapped stone gods in roots, but it didn't erase everything. There's a place called Copan, deep in what is now Honduras. In one of the final centuries before the cities went quiet, a king had a staircase built, 70 steps, each one carved with glyphs, stories, names, dates, the longest known Maya text, a stone book, and at the top, his throne. But the staircase collapsed before it was finished. The glyphs fell out of order. The story scrambled, and for centuries, no one knew how to read it. Even now, archaeologists and linguists are trying to piece it back together. They know what it says in pieces. They can translate the glyphs, but not the full meaning. Because the order is broken. Like the world it came from, they tried to hold on. Some kings cut back on rituals. Others doubled down, built more temples, demanded more offerings, dug deeper reservoirs. But it wasn't enough. The cities shrank. The trees returned. The birds sang over abandoned ball courts. And one day, someone lit the last fire, boiled one last pot of maize, and left. Maybe carrying a child. Maybe looking over their shoulder. Maybe not. At night, the Maya looked up and didn't just see stars. They saw stories. Paths, gods in motion, the Milky Way, that pale, misty river above us. To them was the Black Road, a celestial river, yes, but also a portal, a road that connected the living to the dead. It split the sky in two and stretched from horizon to horizon, and they watched it like you'd watch a doorway, waiting to see who passed through. They believed in an underworld. Xibalba, the place of fright, but it wasn't fire and brimstone. It was a realm of darkness. Yes, but also riddles, lords with strange names, trials, trickery. It was a place where even gods could get lost if they weren't careful. And sometimes they did. There's an old Maya tale from a book called the Popol Vuh about two brothers, Hunahpu and Xbalanque. They're summoned to Xibalba, challenged by the death gods to survive a series of tests. A house full of knives, a house of darkness, a house of cold. They win, through wit and luck and sacrifice. They die, and come back. They rise as the sun and the moon. Because for the Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a door, and the ones who passed through it didn't vanish. They transformed. That belief carried through everything, from how they buried their dead to how they carved their temples. In some cities, tombs were placed under the floor of homes, grandparents sleeping beneath grandchildren, bones wrapped in jade, skulls placed with careful reverence, painted red to remind the world that even silence holds memory. In Palenque, a ruler named Pakal was buried beneath a massive temple, his tomb sealed with a carved stone lid, showing him falling, or rising, through the world tree into the underworld. His hands are open, His face is calm, not afraid, because he knew the road. And maybe, in his city's final days, they whispered that story again, when the crops wilted, when the gods went quiet, when the people began to pack. Maybe a mother told her daughter, "Don't stick be afraid, even if we die, we don't disappear." And maybe the girl nodded, took her mother's hand, and kept walking. Today you can still hear Maya languages spoken in the highlands of Guatemala, in the Yucatan, in the voices of weavers and farmers and midwives. Their gods may wear different names, their rituals may have softened, but the threads are still there, woven into cloth, painted into murals, hidden in lullabies in the way they look at the stars. They still plant maize with reverence, still leave offerings at cave mouths, still tell stories of days when kings spoke to the heavens, and the heavens answered. Their ancestors didn't fade and vanish. They became the roots. And every time the wind moves through the ceiba trees, or a child learns an old word that no textbook teaches, you hear it, the echo, the heartbeat. The world, remembering, the jungle closes its arms, the stone cities exhale, and we step away gently, leaving behind roots and starlight, and the ghosts who still whisper between the trees. Now the air changes. No more vines, no soft moss, just dust, heat, and the roar of a crowd. Then listen, the vines have faded, the air is dry now. It smells of iron, dust, sweat, and something older, something tense. You're in Rome, or just outside of it. The sun is high, the shadows short. People gather in waves, not for a festival, but for a fight. You don't hear birds, you hear footsteps, thousands of them, sandals against stone, murmurs rising like steam in the heat. Men in cloaks, women in veils, children clutching their parents' robes. Wide-eyed, everyone's moving toward the same place, the Colosseum. It towers ahead like a cracked tooth of the gods. Massive, ringed in arches, its stones weathered by time but not yet broken. And inside is where blood becomes spectacle. You pass under one of the arches. It's cool for a moment, then darker, then suddenly bright again. The arena opens before you, a pit, a stage, a trap. The sand is raked smooth, but not clean. There's sets red in it. There always is. The gladiators haven't entered yet, but they will. And when they do, this place, this roaring, echoing bowl of dust and breath, will become something else entirely, something alive. The Romans didn't invent cruelty, but they refined it, sharpened it, polished it like bronze, until it gleamed. Because this wasn't set just violence, it was art. Then let's stay here a little longer. Let's walk down the stone steps of the Colosseum, slowly, past vendors selling figs and wine, past guards in crested helmets, past slaves carrying water in clay jugs. The heat presses close, the hum of the crowd deepens. You find your seat, stone, hard, and sun-warmed. You can't help but think how many people have sat here before you, centuries of them, watching, waiting, whispering the same question. Who will die today? This wasn't just a fight. This was ritual, theater, politics. A tool. The emperors used games to win favor, distract the people, remind them who held the power, and who could take it away with a glance. Bread and circuses, they called it. Keep the stomach full, and the eyes entertained. And no one will notice the chains. Down below, the gladiators waited in shadowed chambers. Some stretched, some prayed, some vomited, some were silent. All of them knew, once they stepped onto the sand, everything would be seen, every mistake, every drop of blood, every final breath. Because this wasn't set just about survival. It was about performance. Gladiators weren't always slaves. Some were volunteers, some were condemned criminals, Others were captured soldiers, forced into the arena as punishment or spectacle. But once they were here, they were all the same. Property, trained like animals, kept like weapons, and yet, something strange happened. They became heroes. Crowds cheered for them, painted their faces on walls, wrote their names on wax tablets. Women sent love notes. Men placed bets. Children mimicked their fights with wooden swords. Because the gladiator wasn't set just a killer, he was a story. And Rome adored a good story. Each gladiator had a type, a role, like characters in a play. There was the murmillo, heavy helmet, large shield, short sword. The thrakes, curved blade, crested helm. The retiarius, no armor, just a net and a trident. Fast, slippery, dangerous in a different way. They weren't set meant to be equal. They were meant to contrast, to challenge, to thrill. The games followed a rhythm. Music, announcers, even choreography sometimes. And when the fight ended, when one man lay bleeding in the dust, the real performance began. The losing gladiator would raise a finger, ask for mercy, and the crowd would decide. Thumb up meant life. Thumb down didn't always mean death. That's a myth. Sometimes it was reversed. Sometimes it was a wave, a chant. But what mattered was the emperor. If he gave the signal, silent or dramatic, the victor would step forward and end it cleanly, if they could. Not for kindness, for show. A good kill was respected, a sloppy one, shamed. Because even in death, the gladiator had to entertain. Away from the sand, behind high walls and locked doors, there were the ludi, the training schools. They weren't such schools the way we think of them. They were prisons with routines. The gladiators lived there, ate there, slept in cells, trained in yards, watched each other bleed in the dirt. And every day, they prepared for a show that might end with their own blood in the sand. The lanista, the trainer, was both coach and warden. He taught them how to fight, how to fall, how to make pain look good. But he also owned them, bought and sold them, punished them, used them. And make no mistake, training was cruel. They were beaten, starved if they disobeyed, sometimes branded, burned with a hot iron so they could never forget who they belonged to. But they were also fed more than average slaves, given better medical care. Not out of mercy, but investment, because a good gladiator could draw a crowd, and a crowd brought coin. No one wanted a broken fighter. They were trained in pairs, matched by weight, skill, type, sometimes forced to fight their friends, or strangers, or even their own siblings. There are stories of twin brothers, of fathers and sons, made to raise blades against each other while Rome laughed above them. Weapons were dulled in training, but the bruises were real. The wounds, frequent. Infection was a constant threat. And the worst pain was never the blade. It was waiting, because the fear didn't come all at once. It built slowly. Every sound of the trumpet, every rehearsal of death, every cheer that wasn't for you. And if you survived your first fight, you got a number, a tally on your record, and then you were sent back below, back into the cells, into the stone, into the silence. In the mornings, before the main games, before the grand duels and roars of approval, the arena served a different purpose. Justice, they called it. Justice in blood. Criminals, traitors, runaway slaves, the condemned. They were brought into the arena, not as fighters, but as victims. No armor, no weapons, no hope. And what killed them was instead always human. They called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. Lions, bears, panthers, starved, beaten, and caged beneath the arena, released into the light when the drums sounded. Sometimes, the condemned were tied to posts, sometimes left to run, sometimes made to wear costumes, dressed as myths, as villains from old stories, to die in character for Rome's amusement. They were torn apart, sometimes in seconds, sometimes much slower. There are records of criminals sewn into animal skins, then set loose, so the dogs would hunt them as prey. Others were burned alive, or crucified, or forced to reenact scenes from Roman legends, where death was the scripted ending, and people watched. Children, nobles, priests. They ate bread, drank wine, laughed. To them it wasn't cruelty, it was punishment. It was order, a message carved into the flesh of the unwanted. This is what happens when you step out of line. And beneath the arena, the blood never dried. The Romans dug channels to drain it, covered the floor with fresh sand to soak it up, but the smell, it stayed, always. And sometimes, it wasn't said just criminals. Rome staged naval battles and flooded arenas, executed entire groups, sent Christians into the ring with no chance, no armor, only prayers. The arena was, in it, always about spectacle. Sometimes, it was a warning. Sometimes, it was a sentence. And sometimes, it was a mirror, showing the crowd not who the victims were, but who they themselves had become. Some lived. Not many. But some. They won enough fights, spilled enough blood, earned enough cheers. And when the time came, when the crowd roared, not just for a victory, but for mercy, they were given a wooden sword. It wasn't stet sharp. It wasn't tet meant to be. It was called a rudis, a symbol, a sign that the fighter was free, no longer a slave, no longer a tool, no longer owned by anyone. And the crowd would stand for that moment, not for the sword, for the story, because everyone loves a survivor. But here sets what no one talks about. What happened next? Because freedom isn't always clean. Where do you go after killing for sport? Who do you become after years of violence are all you've known? Some chose to retire far away, vanish into villages, open taverns, marry, raise children who never saw the arena. Others stayed close, became trainers, teachers, returned to the ludus, the school, to shape the next generation of killers, because it was the only world they understood. And some went back to the arena by choice, not because they loved it, because they didn't yet know how to be anything else. There's a legend of a gladiator named Flamma. He was offered the rudis, his freedom, 4 times. 4 times he refused. He kept fighting and dying until one day he didn't stand up. You can still see their names in mosaics, on broken plaques, carved into marble, half erased by centuries of weather. Spiculus, Verus, Carpophorus. Not heroes, not villains, just men, raised in dust, remembered in stone. They were the lucky ones, the survivors. But survival, in Rome, didn't that always mean peace? It just meant you got to remember more. And sometimes, that was the cruelest part. Then the stone fades, and the sand falls silent. Now, it stands cold. The air sharpens. The sky darkens, and in the distance, you hear the creak of longships, the beat of oars, the wind catching in sailcloth, like the breath of old gods. You sacred quarter in the north now, where the nights stretch long, where the dead are not buried softly, and where stories, brutal, impossible stories, are told beside the fire. Then the stone fades, and the sand falls silent. Now, It sits cold, the air sharpens, the sky darkens, and in the distance, you hear the creak of longships, the beat of oars, the wind catching in sailcloth, like the breath of old gods. You soar in the north now, where the nights stretch long, where the dead are not buried softly, and where stories, brutal, impossible stories, are told beside the fire. They called it the blood eagle, a ritual, a punishment, an offering, and maybe a myth. But if it happened, if even once, someone felt what it was to be broken open this way, then it's worth remembering. The tale goes like this. A man was captured. A traitor, a king's killer, or simply an enemy whose death had to echo. He was bound, arms stretched wide, back exposed. His ribs were split from the spine, pulled outward, his lungs drawn out, and laid over the shoulders, spread like wings. Alive, they say. The man was kept alive through it all, breathing, barely, through lungs no longer inside his chest. That was the image. That was the terror. Not just death, transformation into pain, into punishment, into a warning so vivid no one would ever forget it. But did it happen? The Norse sagas mention it, vaguely, old poems, filled with pride and horror. But sagas are strange things. Half history, half thunder, written down long after the fires had cooled, by men who had never drawn an axe in snow, who maybe wanted the Vikings to seem monstrous, or holy, or both, because the Vikings were not simple raiders. Not always. They were traders, explorers, builders, but they were also people of myth, and myth loves cruelty. Some scholars say the blood eagle never happened, that it was symbolic, a phrase, a way of saying he died horribly. Others argue it was real, maybe not common, but real, because the sagas were careful with words, and pain in those stories always meant something, a debt, a vengeance, a scream sent up to Odin himself, the god who hanged himself on the world tree for 9 days, pierced by a spear, to gain wisdom, the god who knew that knowledge often comes dressed in agony. So maybe the blood eagle wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was offering, to the Norse. Death was not the end. It was a doorway, and how you walked through that doorway mattered. A farmer who died in bed, peaceful, warm, surrounded by family, might be mourned, but a warrior who died in battle, he was called, his soul taken by Valkyries, lifted from the broken body on a spear-pierced field, carried through the sky, to Valhalla. Odin Test's hall, a vast chamber, where the ceiling was made of golden shields, where the benches were crowded with warriors who had died well, drinking, laughing, sparring with blades that never dulled, and every day they fought. Every night they feasted, preparing, not resting, preparing for Ragnarok, the end of the world. Because to the Norse, even paradise was a rehearsal for something worse. But not all dead went to Valhalla. Some were taken to Folkvangr, Freya's field, a gentler place, no less noble, and others went to hell, not punishment, just stillness, a cold, shadowed world beneath roots and stone, where forgotten souls wandered like smoke, and some were given to the sea, because water was sacred. The Norse feared it, fed it, trusted it. Ships were burned with the dead still aboard, or sunk slowly beneath waves, their sails furled like shrouds, their weapons at their side, coins for the journey, food for the waiting. And pain? Pain was never pointless. A wound was a badge, a scar, a story. Warriors carved their bravery into flesh, and songs were written about how long a man could scream without begging. That's why the blood eagle, real or not, haunted them, because it wasn't set, just cruelty. It was legacy. If a man died with courage, if he didn't scream, he was remembered, and if he did, his name was cursed. The sagas say that when a king named Ulla was captured, the one who killed Ragnar Lothbrok, he was sentenced to the blood eagle, and as the ribs broke and the lungs were drawn out, he said nothing, not a sound, not a cry, and so his killers respected him, because in the Norse world, even your enemies deserved honor if they died well. There's a strange purity in that, a system where pain had weight, where sacrifice meant something, where every death was judged, not by its tragedy, but by its silence. The North was cold, but it remembered. A Viking child didn't get to stay soft for long. From the moment they could walk, they were watched, measured. Were they strong? Quiet? Could they endure the cold? The hunger? The bruises? Childhood was not protected. It was tested. Especially for boys, they were expected to grow into warriors. Not later, not someday, but soon. Their toys were wooden weapons, their games, rehearsals for violence. They learned to row before they could write, to track, to hunt, to bleed without flinching. And girls, they were not spared. A Norse woman might raise a house, or raise one. Shield maidens weren't myths. Some fought, some led, and even those who didn't carried their own kind of steel. In the way they spoke, in the way they gave birth alone, in the way they kept the hearth burning while their men vanished into storm. Weak children sometimes weren't kept. That's the quietest truth. If a baby seemed sickly, too small, too slow, it might be left outside, not out of cruelty, but belief that the gods would take it, or the cold, and that this, somehow, was nature's will. Not every child got to grow, but those who did grew fast. By the time they were 10, some were sailing, fighting, watching men die. By 12, they might have seen more than most modern soldiers. There are graves of Viking children buried with weapons, with tools, with animal bones and bits of silver, because even in death, they were seen as something more than innocent. They were becoming, and to the Norse, becoming meant enduring. Pain was a teacher, and death was never far, but there was love too. Songs, stories by firelight, families pressing close under fur, bread shared, names whispered to sleeping children, names of gods, of stars, of wolves that would one day swallow the sun. They lived hard, but they lived full. And when they died, if they died well, they believed they would rise again. Not in peace, not in comfort, but in battle, sword in hand, eyes open, waiting. Then come. The wind shifts again. The snow fades. The fjords fall behind. And now you feel the heat return. Dry, heavy, smelling of sand and burnt stone. You stir in the cradle of civilization. But this isn't a story of gardens or philosophy. Not yet. This is a story of fear. Because long before Rome, before empires marched beneath eagles or kings wore crowns of laurel, there was Assyria, and Assyria ruled by terror. You walk toward a city, massive, walled, impossibly tall. The bricks are carved, not with prayers, but with warnings, images of soldiers, of sieges, of bodies impaled like trees. Assyria didn't hide what it was. It advertised it. They were masters of war, engineers of horror. Their armies were professional, disciplined, brutal. They moved like storms, fast, organized, relentless. They used iron when their enemies still clung to bronze. They had cavalry, archers, battering rams that smashed walls flat. And when the cities fell, because they always fell, the real message began. They flayed people alive, pinned the skin to the gates. They built pyramids out of severed heads, lined the roads with bodies hung from stakes. They sent survivors home just to speak of what they saw, not to lie, but to warn, because fear was policy. Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, Ashurnasirpal, names whispered like curses. These kings didn't just conquer, they broadcasted it, commissioned stone reliefs, showing torture in exquisite detail, not for shame, but pride. Every brick in the palace said, "This is what happens when you resist," and it worked. For centuries, no one dared challenge them. The Assyrian Empire stretched like a shadow over the ancient world, from the Persian Gulf to the Nile, from the mountains of Anatolia to the edge of the sea. The sun rose and set on bloodied stone, but even terror has limits. Because fear can silence, it can control, but it can't unify. And when the empire cracked, it crumbled fast. The people they'd ruled, the ones who'd buried their rage for generations, rose up. Babylon burned their cities. Nineveh, the jewel of the empire, was torn down brick by brick. And those carvings, the ones that showed flayed men and proud kings, they were buried, lost for centuries, until one day, in the dust of modern Iraq, someone brushed the earth away and saw a face again. Not a god, not a saint, a soldier, grinning. The Assyrians understood something that most empires learn too late. Fear doesn't just punish, it prevents. A city that resists must be broken, but a city that remembers the last one that resisted, broken before a single sword is drawn, is even more valuable. And so they made every punishment public, monumental, repeated in stone, in song, in the shaking voices of survivors who returned home to spread the message. Assyrian kings didn't just write laws, they wrote threats on walls, on obelisks, in the margins of empire. There sits a stone inscription from Ashurnasirpal II that says plainly, "I flayed many right through my land and draped their skins over the walls." That steps not metaphor. That steps not exaggeration. That was policy. They used siege weapons with terrifying efficiency, dug tunnels under walls, built ramps of earth to climb over defenses, used sappers to weaken gates, then flooded cities with soldiers trained to kill fast and without pause. Once inside, they targeted elites, nobles, priests, anyone who had once held power, dragged from temples, beheaded in front of crowds. Their homes burned so thoroughly that even the foundations were scorched, and the kings watched, not from afar, from high platforms built so they could observe the destruction like theater, because to them, it was theater. Every execution was choreography. Every display, the hanging bodies, the stacked skulls, was a stage set meant to send a message beyond the battlefield. This is what happens when you cross Assyria, and the terror didn't end when the fighting stopped. They deported whole populations, tens of thousands at a time, forced marches across deserts, families split apart, children enslaved, cultures erased, cities repopulated with strangers. They used exile as a weapon. They controlled identity by destroying it. But here sits the darkest truth. It worked. People surrendered before battles began, paid tribute, sent hostages, carved their own loyalty into stone, not out of faith, but fear. The Assyrians didn't need to conquer every city with fire. They just needed the memory of fire to do the conquering for them. But fear doesn't last forever. Even stone crumbles. Even empires forget how to be afraid. In the end, it wasn't armies that broke Assyria. It was memory, the weight of every cruelty. Every wall lined with skin and bone became too heavy to carry. Their enemies united. Babylon, the Medes, the once conquered, now rising. They didn't come to negotiate, they came to erase. Nineveh, the mighty capital, fell in fire. The palaces were looted, the gates torn down, the great libraries smashed and buried in mud. The kings who once called themselves lions were nowhere to be found. Only ashes remained. The terror that once paralyzed nations turned into dust, and for centuries, the empire vanished. No one even remembered the names until the 19th century, when archaeologists digging in northern Iraq uncovered broken slabs, broken carvings, and stories written in cuneiform. Stories of kings who believed pain was power, of walls that spoke in screams, of cities that killed to be remembered. And now, they are, but not in triumph, not in glory, only in warning. Then the sands of Mesopotamia fade, and the firelight flickers out. Now, you're in the hills of southern Greece. The air is sharper, cleaner, but there's a weight to it. Not from dust or blood, but from discipline. You're in Sparta. And in Sparta, childhood was not a time to grow. It was a time to survive. From the moment a Spartan child was born, they were judged. Literally. Midwives inspected the infant's body. Was it healthy? Strong? Did it cry with enough force? Were its limbs straight? Its form clean? If not, if the baby was deemed too weak to be useful, it was taken to the base of Mount Taygetus and left. No burial, no name, no goodbye. Because in Sparta, weakness wasn't set, just pitied. It was eliminated. This was called eugenics. Centuries before the word existed, a brutal, state-approved thinning of the herd, not out of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but out of belief. The belief that Sparta must be pure, that its citizens must be strong, not someday but always. And if you did survive those first days, then the real tests began. Spartan boys were raised at home only for a few years. By 7, they were taken from their families and placed into the agoge, a state-run training system designed not to educate, but to harden. They slept on straw mats, wore one piece of clothing year-round, were fed just enough to stay alive, and encouraged to steal if they wanted more. But if they got caught, they were punished. Not for stealing, for being careless. Pain was a lesson, cold was a teacher, hunger was a motivator. The body was not coddled, it was carved, shaped into something useful, something obedient. They were taught to fight, yes, but also to endure, to suffer, to bleed without complaint, to kill without hesitation. There's a story, perhaps myth, perhaps true, of a Spartan boy who stole a fox to eat. When soldiers came to inspect him, he hid it under his cloak. The fox began to bite and tear at his stomach. He said nothing, made no sound. By the time the cloak was pulled away, he was already dead. He'd let the fox chew through his flesh, rather than reveal weakness. That was Sparta. And the girls? They were trained too, not to fight, though some did, but to be fierce, fast, strong. They wrestled, ran races, spoke boldly, because they would one day birth the next generation of warriors, and softness had no place in that womb. Only Spartan women, the saying went, give birth to real men. If a boy survived the agoge, the hunger, the beatings, the drills, the cold, he wasn't just congratulated, he was watched more closely, because the next stage was darker. It was called the Cryptia. Sparta never advertised it. There were no parades, no records carved in stone, but the stories remained, whispered by enemies, hinted at in writings centuries later. The Cryptia was a secret rite, a test not of strength, but of cruelty. Selected boys, usually the sharpest, the most obedient, were sent out into the countryside alone. No food, no light, no name. just a knife and a command to kill. Not enemies, not soldiers, helots, the enslaved class. The native population Sparta had conquered generations earlier and forced into brutal servitude. They outnumbered the Spartans by far, and so they were terrorized regularly. Boys in the cryptia would stalk them at night, pick off the strong ones, the leaders, anyone who might dream of rebellion. It was not war, it was execution. And it wasn't set optional. If a boy failed, if he was caught, or showed mercy, or hesitated, he could be flogged, exiled, or worse, seen as soft. Because in Sparta, softness was death. Once you passed the cryptia, you were a man, a full citizen, a homoios. But that didn't mean peace. It meant more discipline. At 20, you joined the mess halls, the syssitia, where men lived and ate together until age 60. You couldn't live with your wife, couldn't own land freely, couldn't leave the barracks without permission. Your life belonged to Sparta. Your body was its weapon. Even love wasn't spared. Spartan boys were often paired with older warriors, not just for mentorship, but for a kind of controlled attachment, affection, yes, but always within rules, always with the goal of loyalty, not comfort. And in war, they were unmatched. Their phalanx, a wall of shields and spears, moved like a single body. They didn't break, didn't run, didn't shout. They advanced in silence, letting the sound of their sandals and shields do the speaking. They fought not to conquer, not for glory. They fought because they were told to, because it was what they were made for. And when they died, they were buried with no name unless they died in battle. Even on the gravestone, only two kinds of people were honored with their names: men who fell in war and women who died in childbirth, because those were the only deaths that mattered. But what happens when every child becomes a weapon, when every kindness is called weakness, when even rest feels like betrayal? Sparta was strong, unshakable, feared, but not eternal. Its warriors were unmatched, its discipline legendary. But over time, the world changed. Battles no longer favored the phalanx. Wars were waged, not just on fields, but in minds. And Sparta didn't adapt. It couldn't stead. The same walls that kept fear out, kept change out too. And behind those walls, the numbers thinned. The cruelty deepened. The society that prided itself on strength slowly broke under its own weight. Because a body trained only for war cannot feed itself. A heart raised to ignore pain cannot feel love. And a child taught only to survive never really learns how to live. The bones of Sparta still rest beneath the hills. The old training grounds are just dirt now. The statues, cracked, the glory, echoing. But listen closely, and you can almost hear them. The whisper of sandals on stone, the sound of a blade, polished in silence, the heartbeat of a boy who never got to be soft. The man was already dead. The year was 210 BCE. Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, the one who united warring kingdoms into one vast empire, who built the first version of the Great Wall, who outlawed dissent, burned books, buried scholars. He conquered the living. He wanted to conquer death, but that wasn't said enough. And so, he ordered the construction of a tomb, unlike any ever imagined. Not a chamber, not a monument, hidden underground. An entire world. And to guard that world, an army, not of men. Over 8,000 soldiers, full-sized, each with different faces, hairstyles, ranks, armor. No two are the same. Crafted by hand, painted in bright colors that have long since faded to ash, but of clay. And they weren't set just for show. They were positioned in formation. Infantry, archers, cavalry, officers, each standing where they would in a real battle, facing east, toward the emperor's enemies, weapons once gripped in clay fists, now rusted or stolen, but once razor-sharp. It was strategy. This wasn't set art, because Qin Shi Huang didn't yet believe he had died. From one realm to the next, and in that next realm, he expected war. Threats, plots. Just as he had faced in life, he needed protection, control, and so, he built it. He believed he had moved, with thousands of hands that would never see daylight again, with labor, with fire. The terracotta army wasn't sculpted in weeks. It took decades, or months. Thousands of artisans, metalworkers, laborers, and prisoners worked through seasons and dynasties, shaping this vision of death in secret. Every face was different, every ear, every crease of armor. They weren't stamped from molds, they were sculpted, by hand, one by one. Imagine the stillness of that workshop. Men bent over clay in near silence. The distant sound of furnaces, brushes dipped in paint, made from ground minerals and blood. Some figures were smiling, others stern. Some were young, others aged. Even the horses, 200 of them, were detailed down to the veins in their legs. Because the emperor believed in control, even over the dead. He didn't just want protection. He wanted a replica of power, a shadow of his own greatness, his chariots, his officials, his weapons, even musicians, acrobats, claybirds, trees. It was a city beneath the ground, a world designed not to rot, and yet, so much of it has crumbled. The colors faded the moment they were unearthed. Bright reds, greens, purples, all flaked away, as oxygen kissed them for the first time in 2,000 years. That's why the archaeologists stopped now. Hundreds, maybe thousands more figures. They know their seps more. Qin Shi Huang Sep's final resting place. But they wait, because today's tools aren't ready. The moment the air touches the ancient paint, it disappears. Gone, like breath in cold wind. And then, there sets the tomb itself. It's just never been opened. Not really. They know where it is. A great mound, still untouched. Beneath it, records say, lies a palace, a model of the empire. The ceiling painted with constellations, the floor inlaid with rivers of mercury, flowing endlessly through underground channels. Some ancient texts warned that the tomb is filled with traps, poisoned pathways, crossbows rigged to fire if disturbed. The Chinese government has left it sealed, booby-trapped rooms. And mercury, not just symbolic, has actually been detected in the soil above the tomb, levels far higher than normal, as if the rivers still flow, even now, out of caution. Because once opened, not out of mystery, the year was 210 BCE. The man was already dead. Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, the one who united warring kingdoms into one vast empire, who built the first version of the Great Wall, who outlawed dissent, burned books, buried scholars. He conquered the living. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to conquer death, and so he ordered the construction of a tomb, unlike any ever imagined. Not a chamber, not a monument, an entire world, hidden underground. And to guard that world, an army, not of men, but of clay. Over 8,000 soldiers, full-sized, each with different faces, hairstyles, ranks, armor. No two are the same. Crafted by hand, painted in bright colors that have long since faded to ash. And they weren't set just for show. They were positioned in formation. Infantry, archers, cavalry, officers, each standing where they would in a real battle, facing east, toward the emperor's enemies, weapons once gripped in clay fists, now rusted or stolen, but once razor sharp. This wasn't set art, it was strategy, because Qin Shi Huang didn't yet believe he had died. He believed he had moved from one realm to the next, and in that next realm, he expected war, threats, plots. Just as he had faced in life, he needed protection, control, and so he built it with labor, with fire, with thousands of hands that would never see daylight again. The terracotta army wasn't sculpted in weeks or months. It took decades. Thousands of artisans, metalworkers, laborers, and prisoners worked through seasons and dynasties, shaping this vision of death in secret. Every face was different, every ear, every crease of armor. They weren't stamped from molds, they were sculpted by hand, one by one. Imagine the stillness of that workshop. Men bent over clay in near silence. The distant sound of furnaces, brushes dipped in paint, made from ground minerals and blood. Some figures were smiling, others stern. Some were young, others aged. Even the horses, 200 of them, were detailed down to the veins in their legs. Because the emperor believed in control, even over the dead. He didn't just want protection. He wanted a replica of power, a shadow of his own greatness, his chariots, his officials, his weapons, even musicians, acrobats, claybirds, trees. It was a city beneath the ground, a world designed not to rot, and yet, so much of it has crumbled. The colors faded the moment they were unearthed. Bright reds, greens, purples, all flaked away as oxygen kissed them for the first time in 2,000 years. That's why the archaeologists stop now. They know there's more. Hundreds, maybe thousands more figures, but they wait, because today's tools aren't ready. The moment the air touches the ancient paint, it disappears. Gone, like breath in cold wind. And then, there sets the tomb itself. Qin Shi Huang's final resting place. It's just never been opened. Not really. They know where it is. A great mound, still untouched. Beneath it, records say, lies a palace, a model of the empire. The ceiling painted with constellations, the floor inlaid with rivers of mercury, flowing endlessly through underground channels. Some ancient texts warned that the tomb is filled with traps, crossbows rigged to fire if disturbed, poisoned pathways, booby-trapped rooms. And mercury, not just symbolic, has actually been detected in the soil above the tomb, levels far higher than normal, as if the rivers still flow. Even now, the Chinese government has left it sealed, not out of mystery, out of caution. Because once opened, it cannot be closed again. There are legends that Qin Shi Huang didn't die naturally, that he feared death so much. He drank mercury in hopes it would grant him immortality. Instead, it killed him. The very substance he hoped would save him became his undoing. A bitter irony. He feared death so deeply. He built an empire underground to hide from it. And now, he rests there still, buried in armor and shadow, surrounded by soldiers who will never speak, by musicians who will never play, by rivers that shine like silver and kill like poison. The terracotta army doesn't yet march, it waits. So now we sit in the stillness. We've walked pyramids slick with blood, heard drum beats echoing in the thin Aztec air, followed Mayan kings into tombs carved from time. We've stood in the Colosseum, where sand drank centuries of suffering, felt the cold breath of Norse gods, listened to the footfalls of Spartan boys, who never got to be boys at all. And now, we rest, under clay, under earth, where 8,000 soldiers keep watch over an emperor long dead and still feared. Each place we visited tonight was soaked in cruelty, but not chaos. These were not random acts of violence. They were systems, beliefs, ways people tried to make sense of the world or survive inside it. Pain wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was a ritual, a balance, a message, or a way to make the gods listen. They didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as part of a story, just like we do. We talk about the past like it sets far away, but it isn't set. The same hands that carved hearts out of chests also carved flowers into stone. The same people who built empires on fear also built aqueducts, temples, poems. The same breath, the same blood. Maybe that's what makes it hard and fascinating. The people we met tonight were not all villains. Some believed they were helping, others simply obeyed. Some took joy in the cruelty, others wept behind the walls they built. And what about the ones who had no voice? The sacrificed, the enslaved, the silenced. Their stories often went unwritten, lost beneath the stories of kings, buried in ash or left out of scrolls. But even now, we hear them. In the silence, in the bones, in the places where pain once lived, but didn't kill the memory. History doesn't whisper because it sets weak. It whispers because it waits for us to listen closely. So, where are you listening from tonight? What does your sky look like now? Is there wind at your window? Rain on your roof? Stars above your street? Somewhere, maybe 1,000 years from now, someone will wonder the same about us. They'll read about our wars, our prisons, our rituals, our rules. They'll ask, how did we treat the weak? What did we do with fear? What did we do with fear? What did we sacrifice? And to whom? Will they say we were kind? Will they say we knew better and still chose the fire? Or will they pause and wonder if they're hearing our stories right at all? We can set no, but for now, we remember them, the ones who lived in a world darker than ours, or maybe just different. We let their stories drift through us, and we let the silence follow. Because sometimes, the most haunting thing isn't the cruelty. It's how easily we forget that someone once called it normal. So sleep now, or don't est. Either way, I'll be right here, waiting in the dark, with more stories the world forgot, and dreams that still echo.